Hi, everybody. Welcome to the AOBTA Lunch and Learn. I'm the president of AOBTA. Our communications consultant, Brian Scow, is producing this webinar, and our communications director, Matthew Swigert, is fielding questions for Grandmother Winter Jade. We're very happy to have her here, and she will be starting her presentation in a moment. Some things for you to know technically. If you look at the top of your screen, you'll see a little toolbar. Part of it's green, part of it's black. In the black part, it says View Options. Before we do that, if you go to the upper right-hand corner of the screen and enter full screen, we want to do that first. And then go to View Options. And the zoom ratio is Fit to Window. You want to click that. And then you want to go down to the bottom. You'll probably have to go in again and click side-by-side mode. This is what we've learned gives us the best view of the slideshow and the presenter. Also, in this webinar, and if you have any difficulties with that, please just type it into the chat and one of us will try to help you with it. You should also know that during this webinar, we can't see or hear you, but you do have the chat feature available. And if you have any questions for Grandmother during the presentation, please type them in to the chat. Matthew's going to keep track of those, and she'll be answering your questions at the end of the webinar. This webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording will be made available to you tomorrow on the event listing on the AOBTA website calendar. You're also going to receive a link to a new feature. We're adding a discussion group called a forum on our website, and you will also get the link to that tomorrow. So, Grandmother Winter Jade Forest is a shiatsu specialist who's lived and practiced and taught across the United States and Europe since 1975. She studied directly with Dr. Shizuto Masunaga, the creator of Zen Shiatsu, and apprenticed with Shinmei Akinobu. Let me do that again. Shinmei Akinobu Kishi, who was Masunaga's #1 protege and creator of Seiki Soho. When she returned to the States, she was one of the 13 practitioners across America who triggered the formation of the AOBTA, and she served as co-director of education until it was formed. Her interest in indigenous medicine led her to 7 years of study with Cherokee priest Grandmother River. She herself was ordained into the priesthood in 2014 and is now known by her Cherokee name, Grandmother Winter Jade. So I'll see you again at the end of the presentation. Grandmother, please begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. It's really good to be here. I just want to, in the spirit of full disclosure, I just want to say this is the first time I've ever done a webinar. So if there are any glitches or things like that, I'm apologizing in advance. But I guess, so Brian, I guess we can go to the first slide. I might as well just jump right in. These are pictures of Masunaga and Kishi. And I had the opportunity to study with both of them directly, which was, I can't even explain how wonderful that was. Masunaga was known in Japan for being a brilliant diagnostician, but not such a great practitioner. Apparently his treatments didn't feel that great, but he was a prodigious writer also, and his writings, the way he thought about this work and everything really changed the way things got done in Japan. He was quite remarkable, a very, I guess you could say, academic man. He was very well read. He studied old Japanese to get more insight into this work, this Asian medicine. And when that didn't take him far enough, he studied Chinese and old Chinese so that he could read texts. He was very brilliant. And he wanted, however, to be a psychotherapist. And that's why he has so much emotional information added on to the typical information that we have, the typical text work. And he found that he couldn't practice psychotherapy in Japan because Japanese people don't just open up like we do. But he found that if he touched them, they would start opening up. And so he started doing his main work with shiatsu so that he could actually get to these things. His protege, Kishi, is my most influential teacher. Now, Kishi was with Masunaga for a long time, but he found a strange limit for his own work in that, and he had to leave and come up with his own, which he called Seiki Soho. I moved to Germany to study with him. I lived with him like the traditional Japanese student apprenticeship goes. I lived with him for 2 years over there and had access to him 24/7, and neither of us needed much sleep. It was almost 24/7 for 2 years. And even though I do not practice Seiki Soho, I still practice Shiatsu. I count Kishi as my most influential teacher. He was extraordinary. He was an extraordinary healer. He was an extraordinarily positive person, and he uplifted everyone that he was with. He died a few years ago. But yeah, Kishi was something special. So those are my 2 main influences in this shiatsu work. And let's go to the next slide. So couple of the distinguishing features from Zen Shiatsu are 2 that I like to mention the most. One is what you're seeing here on the slide, which is the diagnostic areas for the front and the back. The other, and I'm going to come back to these diagnostic areas, but the other sort of seminal thing is that instead of using the yin-yang division that goes from front to back, Masunaga used the yin-yang division that goes from top to bottom. So if you split the body in half lengthwise like we do, we get yang in the back and yin in the front. But if you split it crosswise across the waist, we get yang at the top and yin at the bottom, and that's the division that's used in Zen Shiatsu. So those are 2 main differences. But here I want to look at these diagnostic areas and just say that one of the things that I love most about having these diagnostic areas on the back is that in the process of evolution, and you know, we all like to say that this is a living medicine, and so it changes as times change. And one of the things about the evolution of the human being is that we stand up on 2 legs. And so the emphasis, and over the thousands of years that this medicine has been practiced, then we have also continued to evolve physically and hopefully mentally, emotionally, spiritually too. But this idea of having the hara be not just at the midsection, that is from the hara on back to, you know, the low spine, but also to be the hara and the entire spine as your center of gravity. I like that. It has been very useful for me to think of it that way. Not even Masunaga spoke of it that way, but in my own practice, having used all these diagnostic areas and having, you know, studied alignment a lot, then I have decided that even though he may not have known it when he did it, this is his expansion of the hara. So let's go on to the next slide. So according to Masunaga, the hara diagnosis reveals how a person relates to himself or herself, and the back diagnosis relates to their relationship to the world. This other bullet says that I tend to use the back diagnostic areas more for treatment than diagnosis. That is true. They are very effective for treatment. But this was another interesting thing to me in the theory of Zen Shiatsu, that, you know, we normally, these are things that we don't think as, I don't know, as distinct thoughts or whatever, but we all know that we relate to ourselves a little differently than we relate to the outside world. If you're home alone or sitting in meditation, your experience of yourself is a little different than if you're in communication with somebody else. So this is another thing that I like very much about this system. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, Brian. And now we're getting to the crux sort of this presentation, which is about the distinguishing features of this Hara diagnosis from other kinds of diagnostic tools. And one of the things is that the areas are different from the classical. You know, in the classical system, you have basically 5 areas of palpation, so to speak, that go with the 5 elements. And you have, in one of the most used classical systems, there are several, of course, then you have your fire at the top, you have your earth around the center, and you have your water at the base of the abdomen of the Hara. You have your wood element on the opposite side, so left, and you have your metal on the right. And here you can see that I don't get to point, do I? Can you see this pointer? Is that working, or is that just on my laptop? Can somebody tell me, Brian, can you unmute and
Yeah,
tell me?
that's just on your laptop.
Okay, so, all right, then let me just say that the top 2, the red one and the dark green one, those are your heart and pericardium diagnostic areas. So there's your fire at the top. That brownish yellowish one, that darker yellow gold color around the navel, that's spleen. So there's your earth in the middle. And then the black and gray are kidney and bladder. So there's your water at the bottom. So it's not that different there. But then you have over on the right side, you know, your left as you're looking at it, but the right side of the body, you have your gallbladder and liver and lung separate from just the elements. And the same is true on the left side of the client or this drawing. The heart is at the top, and then stomach, triple heater, and lung again at the bottom, the white one. And then you have your large intestine along the ASIS and down to the pubic arch. That's that other white thing. And then you have your small intestine overlapping and going deeper, actually, than bladder and kidney. So those are the distinct areas. And some of them have more than one area of location. So when this note says there can be 15 to 19 locations, what we're saying is you have your 12 meridians, but some of them are bilateral. Lung and large intestine and small intestine are bilateral. So there's 3 added to the 12 meridians. So there you have your 15. That's the least amount of palpation you'll be doing. But some people actually palpate the kidney and bladder areas at 3 different points, at the base and around at the top. And so that's 2 meridians with each with 2 more. So if you add the 4 to the 15, that's where you get the 15 to 19 locations, but it's still only 12 meridians. And then another of the distinguishing features that I want to speak about is that Kyo and Jitsu are not the same as excess deficient. And this is a common misconception, I think, across the board now when people are studying Zen Shiatsu, that they do equate the two. But what I want to say is the next bullet says the concentration is on the anti-pathogenic key rather than the pathology and symptoms. And so when you're looking at excess and deficient, you are looking basically at pathology. But when you're looking at Kyo and Jitsu, what you're really looking for is what is the healthy expression that will turn around the imbalances. So it's kind of funny because you also may get your symptoms in those same meridians. So if you come up with something like gallbladder Jitsu and small intestine Kyo or something like that, you still might get symptoms that go with gallbladder and small intestine, but you might not. So what your client has told you in the intake may not match with the meridians that you get. But your job as a Zen Shiatsu therapist is then to figure out how those symptoms actually relate to the true expression of the energy that's coming off your client at that time. All right, let's try the next slide. All right, so what I just said before about your diagnosis maybe not matching with the symptoms, this means that in Zen Shiatsu, your diagnosis can be subjective rather than objective, because you're not going only by the symptoms. And what I really like about this is that there is respect for the fact that I, as a practitioner, may be seeing a client whom you also see for shiatsu treatments. That client will give us both the same set of symptoms and what they want to work on, but you and I may come up with different diagnoses, not because one of us is wrong or both of us, but because the way I relate to that client is different than the way you relate. And what I can do to help them is a little different than what you can do to help them. And what their energy is telling us, as telling the practitioner, is what you can do to help balance me and harmonize my energy. And I love that. On the other hand, it makes the work of the practitioner a little more difficult, because you have to really be able to know what the kyo and jitsu are for you to work effectively in this way. And there is only one technique that tells you what the kyo and jitsu is. And this technique, I think, has been lost over the years since Masunaga's death. And it means that when you hold the jitsu in the hara and press the kyo in the hara, the jitsu gets less jitsu. And if that doesn't happen, you haven't found the real kyo jitsu. I think what's happening nowadays in the teaching is that because this particular skill has been lost, this particular piece of information has been lost, is that people go around and they feel everything, and whatever, you know, this feels a little more kyo than that, this feels a little less kyo, oh, that feels really jitsu, these other things feel less jitsu, and they pick what they feel is the most kyo and the most jitsu. But if it doesn't get the reaction, it's not your real diagnosis. And that, I think, is a shame that we've lost that. So that's one of the things I really want to teach in May at the convention, to get back to that. It's an important one. Yes, so this last bullet that says it doesn't compromise the effectiveness of the treatment, that you and I get different diagnoses. What will change the effectiveness of the treatment is if you're not really getting a kyojitsu and you have then lost the best way to get to your client for their good, right? So this, I like this, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. That is one translation of the Tao Te Ching. And you know, it really means that you can tell somebody what an apple tastes like, but until they taste it, that explanation isn't real. It isn't full. It isn't complete. It isn't wonderful, right? Until you actually taste that. And that's kind of what this is too. You have to experience it to grasp it, to understand it. You can't just learn it by what I've said. Yeah, you have to be able to feel that. All right, Brian, let's go to the next one. Okay, so I started touching on this already. What happens in this, because this idea of how to diagnosis depends on a certain refinement of your sensitivity in your hands, that you need a lot of practice for this. So first of all, for a person learning this skill, the student has to know what the Kyo-Jitsu reaction is. And then here's the thing, you need a lot of practice, not just in the classroom. And it's very subtle, and it always takes some time to develop, to refine your own senses to get subtleness, right? And so this idea about being encouraged and not to be disappointed if it takes some time, it's going to take some time. And the problem in our culture nowadays is that we're so used to instant gratification that if we can't get it in a relatively short time, we get very disappointed, exasperated, maybe even throw up our hands and say, oh, I'm never going to get this, and don't even try. That is typical. And so I want to encourage you to not do this, to really, the more you don't get it, the more excited I want you to be to get it, because it just takes time. And if you stick with it, you will get it. And this idea of cultivate your frustration, this was one of Kishi's favorite sayings. And this idea was that when you're so frustrated that you are ready to give up, that's exactly when your moment of opportunity arrives. That's when you're on the precipice of like a quantum leap or something. So I also encourage my students to cultivate their frustration. That was one of the best lessons I got. All right, so what this also means for teachers is that they need a lot of clinical experience. They need to have taken the years that it takes to refine this skill in order to be able to teach it. A student wants to know that their instructor has the skill level, but also the experience that if the instructor has a lot of experience, there are a lot of nuances. I think everybody who's in practice knows already that what you learn and what happens in your clinic room can be different. There's a difference between theory and practice. Your theory definitely informs your practice, but with a lot of practice, you yourself see more nuance and can understand a little better what that theory means that you've learned. So I think a lot of clinical experience is very, very helpful if you can get an instructor with that. And I think the norm really is that you shouldn't be teaching unless you've had 5 years of experience in anything that is taught as a skill. I think that's the norm, and or used to be the norm. And I think that that has dropped significantly in the past decade or so. And a lot of people are teaching who may know very well what they're teaching, but haven't had a lot of experience yet. Another thing that the teacher needs is the ability to transmit that sensitivity to students. So I know in my classes, I do like to do a lot of touching of my students while they're practicing to sort of help them move their hands right, to find the right angles of palpation, to relax, you know, to touch them where they're getting tense, let them know where to open up and things like that. So this kind of transmission coming through the hands, I think all of us who are teachers, I think we all know the beauty and importance of that. It really helps. Another thing that's very helpful for a teacher is to be able to see, and I have that in quotes because I'm not a seer, so to speak. Some people actually do see energy. I don't see it. I feel, you know, I'm more kinesthetic about it. But one of my students once told me when I was complaining about not being able to see, everybody talks about they see energy. I can't see. I was complaining. One of my students finally said to me, well, but you could explain it, right? And I go, yeah. Well, then you saw it. Doesn't matter what sense you see with. It doesn't have to be your visual sense. Any sense can be a psychic sense. So I have see in quotes for that reason. Any of you out there who are also not seers, not to worry, but to be able to know somehow if your student is really feeling that kyojitsu reaction instead of some other response, because it's very common to mix up the kind of tenseness of a muscle or flaccidness of a muscle with kyoinjitsu, and that's not exactly it. And if they are making that mistake, which is a very common one in the beginning for all of us, you want to be able to know that that's what's going on and be able to guide them, which is the next bullet, to be able to guide them into some way of understanding what they can do to get a better sense of the kyojitsu. It might be to relax their own body in some place. It might be to move the position where, you know, their juxtaposition to their client. It might be something that they're thinking, but to be able to know that and give them feedback that brings them a little closer and eases off that frustration a little bit, at least until the next level of frustration comes along. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I have no idea what's coming next, actually. Okay, that was the last slide. Okay. So then what I would like to do also is tell you a little bit about what I have noticed teaching across the country. Please excuse me 1 minute. I've got a problem with my own, what's showing on my screen, but I think I can fix that because I want to be able to look at my notes. I don't want to leave anything out. Okay. All right, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I've been seeing across the country as I teach. And I mentioned some of it already, that, you know, that has been some loss of this particular skill about finding the kyojitsu reaction. And one of the things that besides that I've noticed is that students are being taught to go with their best guess, which I think is a fine beginning step, actually. You have to just go with your best guess. Masunaga actually was very hard on his students. And one of the things he said when he was teaching in New York to us was that women can't do shiatsu because they can't make decisions, and you have to make a decision and stick with it. You have to be able to stick with it. When you come up with your kyoin jitsu, you have to be able to stick with it throughout your whole treatment, whether or not you feel anything in the meridians on the way that makes you doubt it. You can't doubt. And women, because they can't make that decision, they can't do shiatsu. When he said that, of course, because most people who study shiatsu and do it are women, the classroom was filled with mostly women, there was a dead silence that hit the room. And he let that be for a little bit. And then he said, and men can't do shiatsu because they can't let out their feminine side. They can't be soft enough to do a Hara diagnosis. And of course, I gladly played the straight man and said, well, then who can do shiatsu? And he said, I can. So he never ever told any of his students that they got a diagnosis right. He would go around in the classroom when they were practicing, and he would ask them what's kyo and what's jitsu, and they would tell him what they got, and he would say no. That was his answer, always no. And then he would go on to the next person, no. He never ever told anybody they got it right. And that worked in Japan because that made people try harder. It doesn't necessarily work in America. People get too discouraged. They feel like they're never going to get it. So fortunately, it worked on me. There must be some kind of Japanese in me somewhere. It worked on me. I'm like, I can make a decision, right? So, but I don't think it works very well. So there needs to be a lot more encouragement for people when they're getting frustrated. And I think a lot of that means that you need time. You need time in the classroom to practice under the guidance of your instructor. And often there's so much theoretical information that has to be put into that class period as well, that there's not as much practice time as could really be used by the students. So that's one thing that I've noticed. And another thing that I've noticed is that our lives are so busy nowadays that we really don't have time outside of class. We don't make time outside of class to teach. And you can't learn any skill without practice. I mean, you know, there are basketball players who practice the same shot for hours at a time until they get it right. I once had a student who was a pianist, a classical pianist, a performing pianist, and she would drive her family crazy by practicing just 2 notes for hours until she got it just the way she wanted it for that piece. We don't really have that in us anymore. And I think there has to be some way to really encourage that. You need to practice. You just need to practice. And if as a practitioner, you don't have a full-time practice, you could probably use to do a little more shiatsu on your family and friends. If you're going to develop the kind of sensitivity that I'm talking about for this Hara diagnosis, there's no substitute for practice. That's just how it is. But another thing that I wanted to tell you, as much as I understood about sensitivity from Masunaga and especially from Kishi, there was a way in which I did not, I'm going to say appreciate, but I don't mean I didn't like it. I mean, I didn't have enough understanding to have a full appreciation of this talk that we do of energy in Asian medicine until I started studying with my shamanic teachers of cultures that were closer to my own. So in particular, the Cherokee culture and the Russian shamanism culture have made very strong imprints on me. And by studying these indigenous medicines in a way from, like I say, these cultures that are a little bit closer to my own, I began to understand more deeply what energy meant from this Chinese medicine point of view. When we study from Asian cultures, I think this idea of energy sounds very spiritual to us, and it is. But we also, in our culture, make a difference between spirit and body. That even though if we don't believe it in our minds anymore because of our studies, we still have that same emotional response because it's the culture we grew up in. And what I came to understand through studying these other ways is that in India, for instance, being in a monastery, um, not as we go to a monastery for what do you call a retreat or something like that, but in that culture, if you're in a monastery studying to become a lama or a guru or whatever, what happens in your meditations and things like that is that extreme emotional releases happen. We don't think of that in our culture as being what meditation is. We think it is a quieting of the mind. It is a going beyond emotions. And we don't really, this is my impression. I have to say, this is just my impression, but we don't really have the same cultural, I don't know what the right word is, connection, the same cultural feeling about spirit and energy as Asians do. And so going closer to my own roots, I found that I could, with the techniques from those indigenous practices, I could get a deeper feeling of a personal relationship with the elements, a personal relationship with the earth, with water, with fire. I really do feel at this point that the earth is my mother, that if there is DNA, then spiritual DNA is the earth is my mother and the heavens is my father. I really have them in me like that. And the elements are my sisters and brothers and cousins. And it feels very, very personal. And it goes deeper that way. And having had that experience, I was able to come to a deeper understanding of what my Asian teachers were teaching me, my Japanese teachers. So what else do I want to say? Excuse me while I just look at my notes. I want to see if there's something else. Yeah. Okay, so at this point, because I now have that feeling about these elements being my relatives, when I touch my client, I have that same feeling about them. I'm touching all of that in them. And I think it really helps with the healing response of my clients to feel that much of them. So when I think about, you know, if I am one of the few teachers left that studied both with Kishi and Masunaga, and if I think about how I want to continue that lineage, this is the piece that I really want to bring to the fore in that lineage, is how much the sensitivity is a part of Masunaga's work. How, although he was such an academic guy and the learning is really important, the knowing of all of that is really important, the thing that really makes that knowledge usable is the refinement of your sense of touch And that comes from your heart as well as your mind, as we all know. None of the things I'm saying are different. The difference comes in the emphasis on it and the experience of it. So that's pretty much what, and I hope that I can bring in those 4 hours in that workshop in next May at the convention. I hope I can bring that to the people who come to it. I really, really would love to get that across. And for me, the best way that I'm getting that across these days is that every year I hold a 4-day residential workshop retreat in Shiatsu in a retreat center on Lake Michigan, where we can really just hour after hour after hour after day after day after day really immerse ourselves in this feeling, in this development of our sensitivity, in this just beautiful space that we go in to get there. That's the important part from my point of view. That is what I hope to pass on. Okay, so I guess that's all I really want to say about that. And yeah, so Matthew, if there are any questions coming, it might be time. I do better when I have questions to answer than just to talk.
I understand that. Absolutely. Well, there are some questions. So right now I just see 3 open questions, but I believe we can, excuse me, invite participants to add in questions as we discuss here and go along. We have a little time.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. The first one was a fairly practical question from Marco Pratico. He says, in your experience, do you use back diagnosis with the client sitting or lying down?
So in my practice, I very rarely use the back diagnosis. As I said, I use the back diagnostic areas more for treatment. But if I were to use back diagnosis, I probably would do it with them lying down, just because I work on a table, I don't work on the floor. You could do it sitting up. You could do how to diagnosis sitting up too. But if a person's lying down, they're more relaxed, and the more relaxed they are, the easier it is to receive the energy that they're giving off to you.
Perfect. I think he probably is satisfied with that answer. Agnes.
By the way, let me say hi
Yeah.
to him. I just met him a couple of days ago online. So hi, Marco. I'm glad you're here.
Great. And then Agnes Sadre, she says, how about the importance of self-practice such as Qigong or meditation? I'm assuming that's in the context of developing that sensitivity.
Yes, I agree that that is what I would say. It's very important. And from my own point of view, the meditation practice or whatever practice puts you more deeply in touch with all the energy that's out there for us, that is really, really important. The physical conditioning is also really, really good. But and I'm just going to say these are all my own biases. This may not be true for you or for someone who's listening, but in general, I think the bias of our culture is that the physical is a physical thing. Whereas in Asia, if you're doing Qigong, you are what they call the secret part is as important or more important than the actual physical movement that you're making. And so your ability to feel that golden elixir coming into you while you're doing a certain treatment is almost more important, not a certain treatment, a certain movement is almost more important than the movement itself. On the other hand, my experience has been in doing yoga. I don't do a lot of Qigong. Yoga is more for me. But if you get your alignment perfect, and that's why I love Iyengar yoga, because it really emphasizes the alignment of the body when you do it. And something happens when you get in that alignment and you have the right thought. You're really talking to your cells and letting them talk back to you. There's something about just being perfect in your execution of technique that also, boom, opens you up to a bigger spirit. So they feed each other, I have to say, and whichever way is your preference is probably a good way, as long as you don't leave out either.
Great. Thank you. Jessica Sear is asking, can you talk about the importance of Shen in diagnosis?
Can you ask her to write to you a little bit more about what she means about the importance of Shen? Shen is such a big concept. I don't know exactly what she's trying to ask.
Okay, so she'll probably follow up then. Great.
Okay.
Sakiko is saying, thank you so much for this inspirational talk. She would like to hear you talk a little more about Kyo and Jitsu. Since you have mentioned that they are not the same as deficiency and excess, I know it is not probably possible to explain by words, but I'm very interested to hear how you would describe it.
Okay, I actually thought about this last night, so I'm glad you asked. And one of the things that I want to say about Kyo and Jitsu in terms of it, there being two different parts of antipathogenic ki or chi. Ki is just the Japanese word for chi. This idea of the anti-pathological aspect means that even though when we diagnose, we think we're looking for something that's wrong, when you're diagnosing Kyo and Jitsu, you may be able to identify what's going wrong in the body, what's out of balance, what's in disharmony, what's painful or whatever. But what Kyo and Jitsu are really telling you is, what Kyo especially is telling you, is that this is the energy, whatever meridian that is. Let's just call it something. Let's say kidney's Kyo. Kidney is the energy that is going to help me balance out most of what's going on. So what we're kind of saying about that Kyo is that this is really the healthy energy. We're not calling it a pathology, even though the person may be tired from overwork or have some other kidney manifestation. The fact that kidney came up as Kyo is telling you that this is what's healthy and needs more expression. It's not what's wrong, right? And what's Jitsu is usually, because the Kyo is what Masunaga called hidden. It's the hidden aspect. It is under the surface. It is needing more expression, can't quite get it out. And so it's I don't know what its delicacy or its vulnerability, or whatever you want to call, is being protected. And the Jitsu protects it by saying, me, because Jitsu is hard and out there and, okay, get my shoulders, get my neck, whatever, come on. And it helps the Kyo to hide, right? So they are both being very, very helpful to the system at the time. They aren't indicating what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that helps.
Okay, good. We'll see if she has a follow-up. Jessica came back with a follow-up about Shen in the use of in diagnosis and treatment. And she says, using your Shen to affect a client's Shen in treatment.
Well, again, I don't know her definition of Shen. Let me just say that I'm going to call it spirit, and let's see if that works for her. And of course, one uses one's own spirit for anything. I'm using my spirit just to talk right now. Mm-hmm. So yes, you do. What I would say, what I learned especially from Kishi, is that we have a lot of help from spirit. We as Americans, the founded on this rugged individual kind of sensibility in our culture, we tend to think that we have to do it all. And what Kishi told me, Kishi once said, and it's in his book called Seiki, I can't remember the subtitle of that, something about resonance. And what Kishi said was, I don't know who's getting a treatment, them or me, when he's working, right? And that has been misinterpreted by some people to think that, he's working in such a way that he's actually working on himself. But that's not what he meant. What he meant was his efforts on behalf of other people mean that all this sort of spirit energy is washing over him, right? That he has all that help coming through him. And so when you think about your spirit, I don't think you have to think about what you put out. You have to think about how much spirit you let in, and that naturally emits from you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And of course, that's going to touch their spirit.
Right. Michal is asking, did you ever see Masunaga or Kishi see history and trauma through the Hara? I'm thinking client history or...
Yes, so both of them were extremely psychic. And I was in a workshop with Masunaga once where he asked for a volunteer to diagnose. And a man was in this particular class who was not a shiatsu student. I don't know what attracted him to come see Masunaga, but he was an older man. I mean, at this point, I'm in my 30s. This man was maybe in his 50s. Now I would call him a younger man, but at that time, he was an older man and very belligerent and very disbelieving, very challenging. And so he kind of said, you know, I've got neck problems about his neck. And Masunaga, through a translator, asked him a lot of questions. And then started to say to the rest of the group, the rest of the student body there, what was going on with this man. And he started talking about his low back. He said, and the man had never said what his work was, but Masunaga said he stands at a drafting table on a cement floor. He has low back problems, blah, blah, blah. And the man was just really belligerent. He said, no, that's not true. I used to be an architect. I used to do that, but I don't have any low back problems. My low back has been fused. He had surgery. So Masunaga, without even touching him, knew this. Kishi was so psychic that he saw, when he looked at somebody, he saw their whole history from even past lives into future. So they did not need to rely on their touch for that kind of diagnosis. Kishi was the kind of healer. He had a terrible accident while living in Germany. While I was there too with him. And he had a terrible automobile accident. A bunch of them were going to Spain for him to teach a workshop. And the driver fell asleep going 140 miles an hour on the Autobahn. And they crashed. Kishi was flown clear from the car, as was his fiance, who died instantly on impact. And Kishi, fell in such a way that he totally crushed his first lumbar vertebra. It was destroyed. While he was in the hospital, he grew it back. That was Kishi, right? Amazing. So I can't compare myself to either of them for that kind of, but they had developed their sensitivities and their spirit to a high enough degree where they really did see in a big way. I'm still in process of trying to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Nathan Torrance is asking, in Masunaga tapes teaching in Canada, he starts with back diagnosis and doesn't get to the Hara until much later in the treatment. Did he later change to have the Hara come at the beginning? He's wondering because that's how it seems to be widely taught now, and wondering why Hara diagnosis may come earlier or later in a treatment.
I wonder when that tape was made, and I wonder if that wasn't a later thing. He taught more Hara diagnosis when he was in the States. He may have done it differently in Canada. He certainly did it differently in Japan. But here's what I can tell you, what I would know from all the things that he said, why that might be the case. Masunaga, when he did his treatments, when I was studying with him, he always started in side position. And then went prone, and the last was supine. And the reason why he did this, he said, is because the client themselves, the client, him or herself, is in more of a protected position on the side than any other position. And that lying supine face up is the most vulnerable position. And he wanted to leave that for last so that by the time they had to be face up, they felt already protected, relaxed, a little more sure of the practitioner. that kind of thing. So starting on the back, which is the most protected part of the area, would make sense to me from that perspective. But again, as I told you, he didn't need to touch to do that kind of diagnosis. So you get, from my point of view, you get a better read on your client from the Hara than you do from the back, simply from what Masunaga said. The Hara tells you how that person relates to themselves. So if you want to know what's going on with your client, you're going to start with the Hara. That is another reason, if we are going to start with the Hara, which we do in this country, then you definitely want a sensitivity in your hands, because that first touch on the Hara, if it's strong or pokey or too deep, you lost your client right away. So this idea of refinement of touch is a big deal. It's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Brian just got the title of Kishi's book, Seiki Life in Resonance.
Great.
Just brought that in. Jessica said thank you for your answer to her question. Karen Broyles is asking, is there a concern about the quality of spiritual help around us?
Does she mean, is there a possibility for negative spirits to get us? If that's what she's asking, I would say there probably is. I mean, every culture I know of makes reference to that. My own feeling is that that's why you build up your own strength, your sort of spiritual strength. I like to call it spiritual fitness. You build it up just like you do when you're exercising. But there's a way in which, if you can tune in, this is my belief, that God, spirit, the great mystery of us all, whatever you want to call it, the energy that of creation, source energy, put us here already protected. And if you can be all of yourself, there is an automatic field. We all know about that field that extends outward from the physical body. And if you have your, if you are spiritually fit, then that field has a strong border and should be able to keep things out. However, it needs some attention, just like, just like any fitness. If you want to stay strong, you have to continue doing your sport or continue working out or whatever. You have to continually feed this strength also. And from my point of view, these other indigenous cultures that are closer to our own, the Celtic, the Russian, the Native American, they really help. And for me, they just suit me better. But I think the Asians also there are ways that you can build up that layer of protection that keeps you protected without having to lose your sensitivity.
Right. Yes, she's also saying the negative spirit concern is one part, and the other was in terms of who helps us. I'm thinking perhaps of like the eight immortals might be something the Chinese might call upon, the eight immortals. The Native Americans may call upon
your spirit guides, your totem animals, your guardian angels, whatever. There's a lot of help out there. A lot of help out there. Yeah. Depends on how you want to tune in.
And she goes on to ask then, do you have recommendations for spiritual fitness exercises?
Of course I do. I teach them.
I guess she probably is fishing for a few or one or two ideas.
Well, again, you have to learn the practices. It's not something I can tell you. It's a thing. It's like, yeah, I can say, yeah, do Qigong. But if you don't know Qigong, that doesn't help you, right? You have to learn the moves. You have to learn the practices.
Perfect. Lol, she says. Thanks. Let's see. Brian Scow is saying, Tamai Tempeki and Masunaga's mother would chant the Heart Sutra in difficult cases.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's beautiful. The Heart Sutra is beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm quite fond of Ho'oponopono from Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
I just
Ho'oponopono is
repeat
very
that over
powerful.
and
Yep.
over in the middle of a tough case.
Yes.
Sorry, please
You
forgive me.
want to say the 4 things real quick?
I'm,
I can't remember them.
yeah, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you.
Yeah, it's great. It's beautiful.
Pretty good coverage.
So simple and so profound. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sakiko says that the description of Kyo and Jitsu was great and felt also very much in line with everything she's read by Masunaga.
Ah,
I'm saying
thank
she.
you for saying that. I really want to pass on his work. I'm very happy to hear that.
Do you have any words for how to feel or find Kyo? Any direction you could give to students how to feel Kyo?
Yeah, so this is something that I don't think, this is the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I want to do in that presentation that I'm making in May at the convention. I do want to show you exactly how to do that. And also, like I say, at my retreat this September, if anybody wants to come, I will be going over all those sensitivity things that really refine your sense of touch and make you more able to take in what's being offered you by your client.
That's a
Beautiful.
great way to wrap up, Grandmother. This was just fantastic. Thank you so much for this. I want to remind everybody that there will be a pop-up survey at the end of this. Remember to stay tuned for our next webinar.
And join the forum for further questions.
And when you get the link for the recording, you'll also get the link to the forum so you can continue with this great discussion. This was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Deborah, would you please tell them again where they can get my contact info?
Yes, it's actually on the announcement that went out, and on the website, you can find the announcement for the Lunch and Learn, and your contact information is there. Yeah.
Thank you.
And we'll put it on the forum also.
Thank you.
And we're getting a lot of thank yous and thank you so muches in the chat. Everybody's.
Oh, thank you so much too.
So bow, 3 bows.
Bye.
So,
Bye. Thank you.
okay, well, I have 9:58, but